Gaming tech constantly surprises us with innovation, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes gaming tech talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk. In fact, it often doesn't walk at all. But that's just one of the pitfalls when it comes to tech in general. There have been so many failures in the tech world, so unsurprisingly, it has bled into gaming tech as well. There have been some huge console flops in the gaming world, as well as some useless peripherals that never worked as intended. Clearly, gaming tech is littered with mistakes, so I'll be going over some of the biggest ones ever made. I really wanted to like the Wii U, but I just couldn't. Nintendo plain and simply dropped the ball with the console. The Wii U was released in 2012, and right off the bat, Nintendo didn't know what they were doing. The Wii U had an identity crisis, and as a result of that, the console didn't know its role in the market. It wasn't a stationary console, but it wasn't a portable one either. It was innovative with its gamepad, but it also ran on the same hardware as the Wii. It wasn't inexpensive, but it also wasn't as expensive as PlayStation 4 or Xbox One. It had a poor advertising campaign that caused confusion as to whether the Wii U was a new console or just a new version of the Wii. If you weren't already invested in Nintendo's line of games, it offered nothing interesting for new gamers. For all these reasons, the Wii U was a mess. The Google Stadia is a really unique idea that was just executed very poorly by Google. This push towards streaming content also includes gaming. Just look at PlayStation Now, Xbox Game Pass, and Nvidia GeForce Now. With one subscription, these services give you access to hundreds of games. Google wanted to do exactly that with the Stadia, but they forgot about one major thing. The subscription doesn't give you access to all the games on the platform. Sure, some of the games are free to play with a subscription, but a lot of AAA titles aren't. This means that you have to sometimes buy games inside a subscription to play them. Yeah, unsurprisingly, it didn't go over well with gamers, and Google has had trouble getting games on the platform, so Stadia has turned out to be a flop thus far. The PlayStation Vita is actually an amazing handheld console. It was the first dual thumbstick handheld system, and just had incredible build quality. It felt premium, it looked premium, but sadly, it wasn't treated like a premium device by Sony. The console failed to live up to the expectations created by the PSP through no fault of its own. Sony just didn't support the console as much as they promised. At launch, we got a good amount of games for the Vita, and things were going well. But it's clear that Sony saw the Vita more as a second screen for the PS4 than anything else. It was supported less and less over time, and once Sony expanded Remote Play to PC and Mac, it pretty much became useless since you could game on a much bigger screen. The PS Vita had so much untapped potential. The Xbox 360 was a great console. Seriously, it was one of my favorites of all time. I was a PS2 guy back in the day and planned on getting the PS3, but all my friends wanted the Xbox 360, so I ended up with one myself. I had no regrets, but the one thing that irked me about the console was its build quality. It was clear that Microsoft was slacking in this department because I got the dreaded red ring of death not once, but twice, and had to send my Xbox 360 in for repairs both times. It was beyond infuriating to go weeks without the console while my friends all played together. Like I said, I loved my experience with the 360, but I just wish it didn't fail me 2 times. It felt like getting dumped by the same girl twice. Sticking with Microsoft, how about the Kinect? It may be one of the most controversial gaming accessories of all time. If you bought it back when you had an Xbox 360 to play Just Dance, then that was cool. The problem was that when the Xbox One launched, Microsoft said that the Kinect would always be on, watching your every move, judging you. It was a bit unnerving if I'm being completely honest, and of course, gamers felt the same exact way, which led to a mass migration from Xbox to PlayStation. If Microsoft just didn't make it weird, then maybe the Xbox One would have actually sold well. But they had to make it weird and say some awkward stuff about the Kinect. Oh, and since the Kinect was bundled with the Xbox One, it cost $100 more than the PS4 at launch. Just a bad look all around. I've focused solely on flops in North America, so why not take a look at a blunder Nintendo made in their home country of Japan? The Nintendo 64 was a very quirky console, and it's one of the things I love about it so much. It used cartridges back when consoles were starting to make the switch to CD-ROMs. So naturally, Nintendo eventually wanted to allow the console to read discs and released the 64DD for the N64. The DD in the 64DD stood for disk drive, or dynamic drive, yet this add-on was anything but dynamic. It was a commercial failure, managing to sell only 15,000 units in Japan, which is next to nothing in the tech world. Thankfully, most games originally planned for the 64DD ended up getting ported to the GameCube, so at least it wasn't all bad. The Virtual Boy is one of the pieces of gaming tech that often comes to mind when you talk about failures. Here is a console so ahead of its time that it literally caused headaches. It was one of the first entries into virtual reality, and it showed. The Virtual Boy was touted as the first console capable of displaying stereoscopic 3D graphics, and it certainly did that. Just not well. The console was very expensive at the time and incredibly uncomfortable to have on your face for hours on end. On top of that, what you saw once you had the eyepiece on was a dizzying array of effects and a lack of color that often left gamers with a terrible headache. The Virtual Boy was a good first attempt at VR. It just came out a little too early. Clearly, it needed a bit more polish. Sticking with Nintendo, I'm going to be talking about another relic of gaming's past, the Power Glove. The Power Glove is still one of gaming's most popular collector's items, but not because it's worth a ton of money. Gamers want a Power Glove because it's a piece of history, something they could hang on a wall in their room with pride. The Power Glove was popularized in the movie The Wizard, and it was supposed to allow for motion controls in SNES games, but it barely worked. Seriously, it's like this thing did the opposite of everything you wanted to do. It was so badly designed and infuriating to use, but man did it look cool. It must have felt like gaming's version of Thanos' Infinity Gauntlet, except with much less devastation, of course. Instead, it made its user feel devastated. Ouya is not just something you say when something goes your way. It turns out that it's also an Android-based gaming console. We never asked for an Android-based gaming console, but we got one anyway. The Ouya was a promising console at first, raising $8.5 million on Kickstarter, before being released in 2013. Once it released, everything started to crumble. The Ouya wasn't a very powerful machine. In fact, it was just as powerful as most flagship phones in 2013. Seeing as phones were improving significantly year to year back then, it meant the console wouldn't have a long shelf life. The Ouya also had a very limited library of games and failed to run games smoothly. Even its controller didn't get positive reviews. The console never took off, and Ouya's software assets were eventually sold to Razer. The Philips CDI may have been Nintendo's biggest mistake. Back in the day, Nintendo and Sony were working on an add-on for the Super Nintendo that would allow the console to play discs. The two companies couldn't come up with an agreement over the software, so Nintendo decided to back out of their deal with Sony, instead partnering with Philips to make the disc-based SNES add-on. In the meantime, Nintendo allowed Philips to use some of its characters in games for the CDI, which was a horrible decision. Despite having licensed Nintendo games, the Philips CDI was unable to leave a mark in the gaming market. The Nintendo games released for the CDI failed to hit the mark, and Nintendo and Philips never ended up making that SNES add-on, while Sony went on to make the PlayStation, and the rest is history. Oh boy, those Legend of Zelda games on the Philips CDI were just so bad. Honestly, Link, The Faces of Evil, Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon, and Zelda's Adventure were some of the worst games licensed by Nintendo. We don't want to talk about those Zelda games here. But man, were some of those cutscenes hilarious.